Welcome, everybody, to episode 31 of the Wrist Cheese Radio podcast. I'm your host, Bro Dinky. I am not with Schmidt tonight, but in a podcast first, I am going down a man. I am 1-on-2 tonight, and I'll get to my guests in a moment here in your home for orological hot takes, taboo topics, and often unpopular watch opinions. Without Schmidt, I really don't have much housekeeping or anything to get to, but I do have two people with me tonight. It's kind of interesting because they very much look alike. They are brothers, and I will kick it over to them in a moment. So, boys, why don't you give us a little quick rundown of who you are, where we could find you, and why you might be here tonight.
Yeah, I'll go first. I'm Justin. I run a blog and my Instagram page, The Wristorian. So I kind of do historical deep dives on vintage, mainly dive watches, but vintage watches in general. So I dig into the history and then I write them up, and sometimes other sites pick those up, and 2 years in and here I am.
And then I'm Devin, and I'm the identical twin brother of Justin. I like to say I'm the heart of the Wristorian, and Justin, I usually say I'm the heart of the Wristorian and he's the brains, or if he says he's the brains, I say I'm the heart, either way. But I just help him, basically. We're both into watches, and so I tend to just help him out, find things where I can, dig stuff up, and shuttle it his way. But I'm at Foglark on Instagram, although I don't have that many followers. I don't promote myself that much, so I usually funnel people to the Wristorian.
That's cool, though. You have like a little tag team action going on there, and it's also nice. I didn't know if you were directly involved with the page. I mean, I assume you had some connection to it, but I didn't know if you were team Wristorian or if it was just some sort of like my brother's doing big things and I'm here for the ride. But that's cool that you guys are both doing that. I also can't imagine what it's like to have someone in your immediate family who is, I don't want to say pushing you in the hobby, but even I have close friends that are into it with me, and it's bad. Like we're constantly, hey, guess what I got in the mail? Hey, like, to have a brother in it, I cannot imagine. Like, how is that?
I mean, so obviously we're identical twins. Devin's a minute older than me. So for the past 34 years, it's always kind of on some level been like one-upping a little bit, or just like sort of violently fueling the passion into whatever hobby we're into. Yeah. And so Devin sort of got into watches more than me first, and I've obviously eclipsed him at this point. The Wristorian really is just me, and Devin helps out, as we joke about. He does a lot of the really good stories I've gotten, and some of even the pieces in my collection, Devin sort of pointed out. I do all the writing, I do a lot more on the writing side, but digging them up is him. But no, I mean, luckily we don't like push each other, but you do get that thing, I think, like friends and like even sometimes just internet friends get, where it's like, hey, check out this like vintage like Zodiac Seawolf. It's only $750. It's the original owner on eBay. In fact, Devin's watch that he's wearing, this Doxa, was like that. I knew he liked them, and I found it on eBay, and this guy had listed a Super Seawolf. So the 75 ATM, the old deep diver model. And you could tell on eBay, sometimes it's really easy to like, if you see original owner, or like, hey, I bought this watch at a dive shop, it's been in my drawer. So I was like, hey, Devin, maybe you want this Seawolf. And then literally, like, I think it was like within 10 minutes, the guy posted a Doxa and original Shark Hunter. And it wasn't in perfect shape, but, it was original. So it's like, I'm going to kick that over to Devin. And, so sometimes we're like, especially if we know like, hey, you've got a couple thousand laying around for your neck, easy to be like, you should get this or you should get that. And so there is a lot of that. It's not really competitive, but when you're twins, you get used to sharing stuff, and it's kind of nice to know, like, if I ever want to wear a Shark Hunter for a week or two, I don't have to buy it, and I just know I can borrow it from him. So that's a pretty cool aspect of it.
Yeah, when you admit that I'm half the Wristorian, you can borrow the Shark Hunter. So. Yeah,
that is cool though, because at least when you borrow it, like, there's always, when you borrow from somebody else, there's always a little bit of a awkward, what's going to happen, but each other are good for it in this case. So that's great.
Yeah. Sure. I've definitely had that with, like, when you're at like we don't do a ton of like watch meetups, but I've had times where I've brought, like a few of my mainly vintage stuff in my collection, but I brought it to a watch meetup, and it seems like you always get like one guy who's like too comfortable with your watch. I don't know if you've ever had that, but they're like, they're like, let me check this crown action. Let me check every position and let me like hand wind it.
Yeah.
And like, or like turn the time backwards.
Yeah, let me change the date.
Right. And you know, and I'm like, careful. I don't want to seem like that guy, but it's, you know, I don't want you to like jack up the movements or something. And especially when you get one that you know hasn't been serviced in like a couple decades. It's like, there's probably sand and like grit and stuff in there, and I don't know how to fix it. So just, there's always at least one guy who's like, who's testing out the limits of your watch at a meetup.
He's like, oh, this crown is a little hard to get it in here. And you're like, no.
Let me give it a little wiggle and see if maybe I can get it to set. Yeah.
Is this supposed to come off?
Right, exactly.
That's cool. That's very cool. So it's funny because I was actually familiar with Justin's page and then separately wound up just, I guess, interacting with Devin. So I sort of indirectly knew both of you. And then eventually Devin put me on and I was like, oh yeah, I've seen this before. And I became a lot more aware of it. And then I started seeing it pop up more and more. And like, you know, it's always when people start a blog or a page, you're always like, and I think even when you're the one starting it, you're like, well, where's this going to go? You know, obviously even myself included, because starting a meme page is absolutely ridiculous. And when starting that from 0 followers is even worse, because if people know who you are, you already have a platform, you can kind of work your way into that. When you have 0, I mean, you could just be doing something completely fruitless and at the end wind up with nothing and be wasting your time. I have to imagine that that's what it's like with a blog as well. But to start up from 0 is like, it's really an accomplishment. And, you know, kudos to you for managing to get where you are, because now you've not only got your own blog, but you've branched out into many places, right? I know you've been on a blog to watch and a few other places now. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So you're right. Starting a blog I was sort of like reluctant, I think, at best when I was at the record, you know, because at some point, a lot of our knowledge, I think for both of us, came from literally just like, forums, just like everyone else, things like that. But a lot of it came, you can learn a lot from eBay and you can spend too much time on the site. And I've probably done, but you can like really get a lot of information, especially if you get these people who, you know, were the original owner, and you can kind of get, you know, like primary contact, kind of like primary source level information about a specific model, especially something obscure. And so we spent a lot of time, and at some point it was like COVID and stuff. There weren't as many meetups, and there weren't things I was spending so much time doing it. It was sort of like, well, I might as well try to contribute in some way. So yeah, I was reluctant, but I started the blog, and then, you know, I was fortunate, I think, pretty early on. People were really encouraging me to do it, and I've always been at least decent at writing, and, you know, much easier to write about things when you're passionate about them. So,
sure.
But you know, watch bloggers are sort of everywhere, and everybody has. It's like podcasts too. You know, it's like everyone's starting one up at some point. you're going to be on our podcast probably, and like, you know what I mean? It's just like, that's the way it goes. Yeah. But you know, but I was like, yeah, and even saying, okay, well, I have my angle, or like my angle is watch memes, so, you know, which is hyper specific, or my angle really deep dives into vintage models. If I was a better blogger, I wouldn't have chosen that angle probably, because it's not like it's an infinite well. It is in the world, but finding those stories is like, I'll find like maybe one really good story a year, and then I can find some sort of average ones. And so it's not a constant supply. But no, I had an old Seiko watch I bought that was used in Antarctica, and that was sort of like one of my big deep dives early on, and that kind of got me connected to Cole Pennington at Hodinkee, who wrote it up. And, you know, that was cool for me because that was pre my own blog. But that was definitely sort of the start of me really digging deep into history, because there's only, the exact model of mine's the only one I've been able to find. There's a couple that are super similar, but even then, you know, probably less than 5 that are known of that model. And so, you know, Cole's a big fan of Seiko, just like us. So he wanted to write it up. I got to send my watch to New York to be photographed by Hodinkee. I got to like interact with Cole. So yeah, so for like just somebody who at that point was just a casual fan of watches, and who had invested probably too much time into that exact watch, it was like, well, this is great. I'm going to be on Hodinkee. It's not me, but like it'll say my name and that this is my watch. It's still pretty sweet. Yeah, that got me to Cole, and that was sort of like, hey, I like to write. So he sort of got me to write something for Gear Patrol, so I wrote a couple things up for them, and that led to a blog to watch. At the same time, I started my blog, and like that, I did some work with Craft and Tailored. Like they picked up a few of my articles from my blog.
Very cool.
They connected me to Adrian at Bark and Jack. There's one he liked that he kind of shared. So yeah, it was kind of nice. It was like a good segue to like meet different people in the industry, and maybe their focus isn't these like super vintage, like deep dive kind of things, but one or two of the articles we did sort of like supplement what they're trying to do, you know? So yeah, so that kind of got me connected to them. And then it's led to a little bit more work with Hodinkee, which has been really fun. And honestly, it's like trying to just balance stuff for my site has been the hardest part. And, you know, I can imagine running a meme account for as long as you have, because I'm still like, you know, it's like I'll wake up every day and it feels like I go like, man, after work, I got to start trying to get something written for my site. It's been like a month or 2 months since I've updated it. And I don't just want to throw something arbitrary out there just to say I updated it. So it's sort of like, you know, I want people to know I'm still doing stuff. I figure out, you know.
I feel that. I feel that the need to, I don't want to say stay relevant, but when you have a day job, like putting out content is not your primary focus. I mean, even people who are super into it as you are, I mean, mine is a lot less effort than yours. I'm not going to put them on the same level, but even like, you know, I try to throw something up daily. It's not always easy to come up with something good or find something super relevant or super like something that's going to hit home with everybody every single day. I can't imagine trying to come up with quality historical content, because let's face it, you only have backwards. You don't really have forwards to go unless somebody releases something that is a callback, and then you can kind of use that as a gateway, I guess. But I can only imagine. So speaking of your historical sort of digs, how do you really decide what to go after, and like what methods do you use to sort of sleuth out these horological mysteries, I guess, if you will?
Yeah. You know, it's almost like you got to do like a case study on something I've done it on, you know, like,
don't give away too much of the secret sauce here.
No, it's not secret. I mean, in a perfect world, I can talk to people. In a perfect world, I'll talk to the owner of the watch. You know, if I really can, I tend to like watches with like case back engravings that are really. I don't have a whole bunch, but I've seen quite a few cool ones. eBay is actually a really good place for that too. If you're looking at I mean, you can see a lot of engravings that are really nice. Someone gets like a Rolex sub on Christmas in the '80s. You know, like. Those things I like quite a bit, but I saw an old Pulsar, one of those like Hamilton Pulsar, like digital ones that was
the Bond watch.
No, like the
sort of red LED.
Yeah, like, you know, those like red. They have like a lobster bracelet kind of thing, right? And those were everywhere. I think like in the sort of like '70s kind of '80s era. And I found one that was like on eBay, and I want to say it was definitely under 1,000. It was like under 800, I think, but it was from Elton John to like one of his producers.
Whoa.
That like, you know, from Elton. I did a little research, and it was a guy named, I can't remember his last name, but it was Gus something. It was like one of his producers, and it said the name of the album that, you know, and you're like, and then I looked up picture, you know, that was just typing in this guy's name that he had given it to. And you can see him like in the studio with Elton John wearing that model, you know, and you
That's
go, well,
crazy, actually.
I can't say it's the exact watch. It likely was. I mean, what are the odds? But, and you can see Elton John wearing the same model too. And you're like, well, clearly these guys were all wearing that, you know? Sometimes it's like not too hard. Like that's like a pretty easy one when you get like a celebrity or somebody there's tons of pictures of. But a lot of times I get a watch. I'll buy a watch. I'll know it's interesting enough to buy, and I'm really just kind of rolling the dice and saying like, I think I'll find the history. So that Seiko that I mentioned from Antarctica, it has a dial that's marked MSST and then a year range. And I remember seeing it for like $1,200. This is, you know, years ago, but it's a 6306. So it is a little bit more, you know, it's the JDM version. It's not a 6309. So it's a little bit
original turtle.
Yeah, it's a little bit more valuable than 6309, but I don't know that I mean, this one's probably 1,200. It's worth that. But I mean, a standard one, probably I would have been overpaying. but that dial I knew was unique. They didn't say anything in the description about what it meant. I think it said maybe military, but that was like a shot in the dark, right? And I remember typing in MSST, when I was like, should I buy this? It's a lot of money. And I do love Seiko, so it wasn't like a big stretch. Like if I get a unique one and it's related to like something uncool, it's still a cool watch, right? So it's like it wasn't a huge gamble. But I typed it in and I found some stuff that was kind of like loosely associated. And one of them was an Antarctic program called MSSTS, but it was in the same years. And that was sort of enough for me to like buy it, which this could certainly work out differently than it did. But for me, it worked out well. So I bought it and then I did a lot more research and I was pretty sure it was tied to that specific program. A good thing about a watch like that, and any sort of military or anything that involves like universities and stuff, is anything scientific, is like a lot of these people who were still around, they were listed all the personnel involved in the program. And this was a joint thing between like New Zealand and Japan and the United States. So I could find their names. And then a lot of these people were still, the ones who are still around were still teaching. Like they had like university email. I mean, they were professors.
So there was a contact that you could make there, which is great.
So it was really just like, okay, I'll type in this guy's name who was a lead scientist, and I'll type in, this, and then like Wellington, New Zealand or something like that. And it'll be like Professor what's his face from University of New Zealand. And, it'll list his email. And so that one, I was pretty quickly able to email at least three people who were in the program. And one of them was like, oh yeah, I've got one of those sitting in my desk, and like I said, this is something that a lot of people in like the sort of Seiko and like watch community had never even seen.
Yeah.
And this guy, oh yeah, I have one like literally right next to me in my desk. So he sent me a picture. And so two of them ended up coming back and saying like, oh yeah, I got one of those. And so they were able to tell me what year they got it, who it was that gave it to them, what the text on their dial said, the serial number, why it was given, So that was really nice, because that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, when you get like a pretty much a primary source. Like they were like, I was given this by Japan's Antarctic Research Division leader in Antarctica in 1979. He gifted it to all of the lead scientists. And that was a thing. That's like I'm certainly not like a cultural expert, but gifts were like a big thing. I think in Japan, but certainly for this guy, his name's Dr. Tetsuya Tori. And he's sort of a big name. He passed away, I think, in 2008, but he was a big name in like Antarctic research in Japan. And they so they'll come back, and a lot of these people just love to tell their story. They just love that somebody's interested. And they don't, and I think you'll hear this from a lot of people who do kind of what we do, but they don't always love they don't love like watches the way we do, really.
Sure.
They're sort of like the people who are like I found that like with military, a lot of them are even more. It's like you got to email maybe like 10 times back and forth to kind of like get them to warm up, especially when you're talking about watches, because they're sort of like, I don't, I'm not really, I had a Doxa. I don't really know. What do you want me to say about the dog? It was I wore it when I was diving. Yeah. So they're very much like, it seems like they're the few words, but these sort of like civilian scientist types, they love talking about it, and they tell you stories about how they had American whiskey waiting in their hotel in Japan, because that's what, they wanted to gift them something that they were like, that felt like an appropriate thing from like their home. And, like, it's just cool to get stuff like that. So my process for that was a lot of research on like, there's a lot of historical archives. I did a piece with Cole for Hodinkee last year that was like diving into like government archives. Yeah. So what did we use? We used like CERN,
New Zealand's Department of Conservation, Scripps Oceanographic Institute, and also Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, NOAA.
Yeah. So a lot of these sort of like government or college, I guess, entities have like really, really nice, like complete, like photographic libraries, where you can type in like Tektite if you want to see, that was like an underwater habitat in the 70s. You can type that in and you get like a bunch of photos, and a lot of them are super high quality. I mean, I was always impressed at like how good these photos are. You can like, we were joking about the forensic side of this research, but some of those really, you can zoom in and like practically read you can like read the dial. Like you can really get pretty definitive because this one I did with Cole, we used all sorts of different, I think we each put in like 10 different watch spotting. It actually, you know, I was pretty happy. It was voted like one of the top 5 articles on Hodinkee in 2021.
Which is amazing.
Pretty amazing. Yeah,
right?
they put out hundreds of articles.
Yeah, plenty of articles.
Sure. It was funny. It was number 5, so like, you know, it like barely made the list, but it was technically top 5.
Still counts.
So
I mean, it's not the watches of Space Jam 2, but
right.
That was number 1.
But Danny Milton's all over Space Jam, and I can't honestly compete with that. But still, top 5 was good, and yeah, some of those pictures, I mean, it's like you'd have a person like super far back from the camera. I remember there was one where it was like 2 guys on top of a research vessel in the ocean, and one of them's wearing a Seiko 6105, and the guy next to him's got like a digital Casio. So this would have probably been like early 80s, and most likely he was wearing that 6105 obviously for a while. But it's funny because you could zoom in so well on the photo that you could read the time on the screen of the Casio. Wow. And like you could tell that the 6105 was matched up like almost perfectly with the time on the Casio. So it's like, yeah, some of these archives just have like tons of like really good photos, and so a lot of times we'll look for that. That's tedious. I mean, that's that part of the research process. It's fun. Like if you enjoy the sort of like, you know, the scrolling through hundreds of pages of photos looking for a watch that might be interesting. It's much harder when you are looking for a specific model. You know, it's like, it's one thing if you're just looking through them and you go, I'm going to set aside anything that might be cool, which is sort of what that Hodinkee article was. It was like, we kept a spreadsheet of, you know, and Devin helped a ton with that. It was like, hey, I found one of his was like, oh, I found like an old Seamaster 300 on this guy holding like this crazy New Zealand bird that was an endangered species. And it was like, he identified it, he put it in the hopper, you know, and we could like, and so a few of the ones I put in there were that he found. I didn't find them, I just wrote about them. But it's nice how, that's another nice thing about having like a sort of support services behind the Wristorian is like, I'm still not gonna call him the heart of the Wristorian, but I'll call him support services. I mean, that's fair, you know, because yeah, we'll have this hopper in Excel, you know, we'll obviously start from scratch, and we'll I think we ended up with almost 100 different models we found. Yeah. You know, some of them repeat a lot. 6105s, you see like, you know, 20 of them are 6105s, but you know, which is cool. I mean, I think that's super cool too. But yeah, so the process varies a lot, but the big deep dives have been more like either he's found it and I bought it, or I found it myself. But you buy an interesting watch and then you just like do as much research as you can, and like you're just amazed at what kind of stuff you can really. It's a little scary how much like you can find on the internet, but like, you know, you can find email addresses for people, and you can find images, and you can find like, it's hard. That's the hardest part, is the like, hey, I don't want to freak you out, but I just write about watches, and I think I bought a watch that maybe belonged to your dad. I'm sorry to hear that he passed away 10 years ago. Sure. Do you remember? You know, it's like, it's really, really hard to like gracefully say like, you know.
It does sound like a very well laid identity theft scam.
Yeah, that too.
I can't lie.
I was just thinking the same thing. I'm a Nigerian prince as well, so if you could, you know, it's difficult. Yeah, it's like don't freak out. But
what was your mother's maiden name, by the way?
right. Anytime somebody says don't freak out, you're like, all right, I'm closing.
Social security,
red flag, LifeLock.
Yeah. So that can be a tricky part. It's like, it's, you know, like I said, people just are kind of like, why are you even interested in that?
Yeah.
But many of them have come back and responded and been super gracious, and some of them, I think, I finished the whole article, I send it to them. They're always nice, and whether they mean it or not, they're being nice to me, and I appreciate it. And they're complimentary, and I think they probably leave the experience like not really understanding it still. But I'm just glad because people who are like as deep into the sort of nerdy side of watches as we are, I think they appreciate those stories too, you know. Just the owner might not appreciate it, but sometimes it also lets the owner know that they have something that's more valuable than maybe they realize. There is a benefit to it, you know. It's like the one came out on Hodinkee about that Seiko, and one of the guys I had talked to, a professor, a geologist, he had 2 different models that were used in Antarctica, and both of them had those same special markings because we don't talk about it much in that article, but mine's a 6306, like you said. So it's like the original turtle, right?
Yep.
Or the 6306 was a 6105, which is super popular, the Willard.
Willard,
so So Dr. Torrey on an earlier program gave people 6105s with a specially marked dial. So there's a few of those around. I think we've maybe seen 5 or so. Yeah. So they're still super rare. But this professor I talked to had one of each, a 6306 and a 6105. And he probably, had no idea what they were worth. And truly, I mean, even now you can't, I don't really know what they're worth either. Whatever
how can you really put a price on it when there's so few, right?
Yeah, so it's like, it's not like they like hit the open market that often. And even when they do, so few people know about them, they're probably not worth what they should be, which is good if you're a collector.
Yeah.
Now's the time to get it before people ever really catch on. It's like, it's almost too obscure that I don't know if it'll ever really be as valuable as some of the other Seikos, just because it's like, but luckily all the people who fake these Scuba Pro 450s, which are a really rare 6306, they haven't gotten to faking the like hyper specific Antarctic Seikos. I hope they don't,
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be almost like a tough sell because, like you said, if you're only aware of a handful of them, and let's say somebody who has one, like, what really are the odds of it being legit? Like, if there's 5 of them on there, and you're like,
yeah.
But that is, I mean, I heard you actually talking about that on Rico's Watch podcast. Shout out to Rico. We've both been a guest on that, so that's cool.
Yeah.
But I was like salivating listening because, I mean, I'm a huge Seiko head and I love vintage specifically. I love vintage Seikos. But hearing just like the specifics of the dial text and everything, and then you're like, yeah, I only know about like 4 of these. And I was like, man, that's like, imagine if that was like, not that they're at all in the same ballpark, but like if that was a Rolex, imagine what that would be worth.
Yeah.
Insane money, right?
You get like, it's a different color. You get like red text Submariners.
Yeah.
And like the color of the
Comex,
text.
yeah.
You get Comex, you get some co-branding or something like that. Yeah, but your Tiffany signed. I mean, and that's another thing that I know Devin's really big into scuba branded dive watches and has some pretty special ones. But like, but yeah, having a dial marked for like a specific scientific program, like you said, if you saw that on a Speedmaster, if it said freaking like Apollo 8 or I don't know anything about Speedmasters really, but if it was marked for that mission, like Gemini something, people would go crazy. It was like, oh, that was, I get that Antarctica is not like the moon, but it's about as close as you can get, I think, on Earth. You talk, sort of bottom of the ocean or Antarctica.
I was going to say, let's be real though. There are places in the ocean we have not explored, but we've been to the moon.
Oh yeah,
right?
That's true. Yep.
Yeah, I would also say that some of the habitats that they did in the past, in the 70s and stuff, Tektite was studying how people interact with each other in confined spaces like that for application in space stations or in space shuttles, things like that. And then Antarctica, they tested quite a few vehicles that I've read about for use on the moon. So both of those places, the ocean and Antarctica, both have context in relation to like the moon and space flight. So yeah, something there.
Funny tidbit, and this is total serendipity just in the past day. While I was touching on Rolex and we're talking vintage Seiko, right? Everybody knows James Cameron as the sea dweller, right? Deep sea. I just so happened I was stumbling across it was a post from it was an Instagram post from a movie account, and it was like then and now and like what people used to do in their, I guess, past life. James Cameron was a truck driver, I guess. They have an old picture of him, and you can just type into Google James Cameron young. Clear as day, picture of him like this on the wrist, Seiko Arnie.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen that one.
And then also, James Cameron did The Abyss, and in The Abyss they wear 6309s, I believe, in the movie. So I mean, before they got into some of the Rolex and stuff, I think there's a Rolex in that as well, but most of the divers are wearing 6309s in that movie. So.
But I was like, how appropriate that I was like, I'm gonna be on with the Wristorian, and I found an old photo of James Cameron, Mr. Sea Dweller, wearing an Arnie, which is a watch I actually own, which is pretty cool. I mean, it's the reissue, but still, it's like a cult favorite, of Seiko heads. So I thought that was really cool. So I guess you've been a lot of places, quote unquote, in your journeys. What I guess are some of the stranger things you might have uncovered in your deep dives, or what are some of the the weird rabbit holes you might have found yourselves in, because I don't do what you do, and I've found myself in some weird ones myself. But
I don't know. You can take this one first.
Well, we were talking about this earlier a little bit, just kind of trying to like quickly bring up different rabbit holes. And I mean, I guess off the top of my head, you can jump in, Justin, but like championship canoe racing in Canada, hot air balloon racing, speedboat racing, Dakar rally. What else have we got? We've gotten some weird ones.
Yeah.
Undersea habitats, certainly.
Yeah, there's
outer space, like space flight, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
What else have we got?
But like really weird stuff. Yeah, and like so I'll do like these huge deep dives, but I also do find myself just like researching. I wouldn't call them deep dives, but I probably spend like a couple hours sometimes. But I remember seeing a watch on eBay, probably like it hadn't been a couple of years ago, and it was like an old alarm watch. So it was like 2 crown kind of alarm watch, right? And it had like a big. It sounds ridiculous. It had like a big pigeon like drawn on the dial.
Okay.
Like and it was by a company I think called like SDW or something like that. And I looked it up, and this company made pigeon racing clocks for pigeon racing, which I guess was like
there we go. This is what I was looking for.
I know I didn't want to disappoint. I was like, what's in a really obscure? So pigeon racing used to be a thing, and I don't know if it was like time trial. I don't know how it worked. It was like time trials, but long story short, if you type in that company, you can find lots of they're like almost like a box with like a clock on the end. And this company made a whole bunch, but apparently, at least for a certain amount of time, they probably had like a catalog, and they sold like wristwatches for the sole purpose, obviously, of telling time, but of pigeon racing. And to make it clear, they would put like this big, like multicolored pigeon, like on. I'll send you one. I'll send you an image because I can find them. Yeah, STP, something like that. It's that was an obscure one. I wanted to write an article about it, but I haven't bought one. And now I've probably like blown the lid off of pigeon racing watches. Now I'm gonna have to compete with everybody who listens.
Right.
You know who you got to try to get a hold of? I hear Mike Tyson raises pigeons.
Right.
Oh,
A
really?
Wristorian Mike Tyson piece on pigeon timers would be the pinnacle of watch journalism, as far as I'm concerned.
That's a good lead.
I'm sure we can get him.
I'm sure we can.
I'm sure he's wanting to do it.
We'll have our people reach out to him.
Yeah, we will.
I think it's doable.
Devin, get on that.
Yeah, I'm on it. Mike and I go back away, so I'll talk to him.
Yeah, it should be easy. But that's a pretty obscure one. It's they're very funny watches. They're very like just ridiculous.
Yeah.
But the canoe racing one was a real big. I've talked about that on other podcasts, but it was that was a very obscure, like it was a big centennial celebration in Canada, and it was like this grueling canoe race. And I don't remember, it took like months, I think. It was like months long.
Quite a while, yeah.
It was crazy. And I mean, these were like Olympic level athletes. Like, this wasn't like they were like
paddling on a pond or anything.
Yeah.
There's like bears in the rivers, and they're going down rapids and picking up their canoe and like running with it some distance. And
oh yeah, it's like it's crazy. I remember because Devin has a watch with an engraving on the back that says like how many kilometers and like where they started and where they ended, and it says the Centennial Canoe Pageant. So that one had a lot of information. It didn't have a name or anything, so we don't know who it belonged to, but it had a lot of information about like what the event was. And it's funny because Devin's like, well, this could be a good story. And I'm like, yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's canoeing. I'm not like, it's not crazy. I mean, it's a lot of canoeing. Because I'm like, we've been canoeing, right?
Yeah,
we're in Kansas. We're like, oh, there's some rivers, sort of the Ozark area. It's like some rapids. It's not too crazy.
No.
It's definitely not Antarctica.
Yeah.
And then Devin sent me some like images of these people canoeing, and I swear it was like whitewater rafting. And I remember he showed me one of this. It was like the canoe was like, multiple feet off like a wave. And it was like this guy that looked like Wolverine. He was like super jacked. And it was just like he was like forcing the boat through this river.
Yeah.
And I remember being like, that's just not, in my mind, that's not what the canoeing looks like. That makes it a cooler. And I'm pretty sure I put it in my article because I was like, I have to give people some context. But yeah, it's like this super jacked, like athletic guy who looks like he's like probably powering the canoe by himself.
Yeah.
And it was like not what I expected at all. So I was like, yeah, we definitely have to write that up. And we did. Yeah. And it wasn't our most popular story. I found that the most popular stories are probably the ones that have a Rolex in them.
Yeah, I think so.
that's sort of probably common sense, but it took me a while to learn that. And I haven't given in yet. I've written a couple stories that mention Rolex, but you know, I'm not necessarily in it just for the followers. And there's a lot of people writing about Rolex, and
you get that pigeon Rolex.
you get that. Yeah, if I get a Rolex with a pigeon,
or tutor advisor with a pigeon on it or something, you know,
yeah,
you might be on it.
I would love to find that.
There you go.
I'm a sucker for anything that obscure. But until then, you know, I'm not just gonna say like, because at some point, really though, it's like, you know, Diver in the 70s wore a Rolex. You know, like it's kind of like, that's like, I mean, a lot of them.
Here we go again, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And like you said earlier, like it's like, you know, a challenge obviously is you're only really looking to the past when you're doing it the way we are. And I found that there's like a point in time in the past when watches just kind of got more boring. You know, like there's a point like when quartz came out and you know, I have my own opinions about like quartz crisis and all that. I mean, there was a lot of innovation. I like quartz watches. I have quite a few. But yeah, at some point it's like anybody doing really intense stuff was basically like, I'm going to buy a Casio for like $20 or a G-Shock, you know. And I think at the same time, then you kind of started seeing Rolex really push to like this more status symbol side of things.
Yeah.
And then you just don't get as many people who are like on an oil rig with a Submariner, you know, like it's just, so it's like, yeah. So it's like you kind of have like these decades from sort of like the 60s up until maybe in the 80s where it's like you can get like really good stories. And then at some point, you know, it sort of tapers off. The Rolex becomes more of a luxury thing. You know, you just get like generic digital, stuff like that. And so, yeah, so I have like a very finite sort of like few decades that I kind of have to look in. And and I worry that someday all the good stories, it'll just be people wearing G-Shocks or something. And and you know, by then maybe somebody else will have taken the mantle of the Wristorian and I won't have to worry about it. But that's a major challenge too, for sure.
But that's cool though, because you know, whether it's canoes or pigeons, I think everybody, they've had their fill of the, like you said, the diver wearing the sub, or the race car driver wearing said chronograph, or everybody knows about the moon missions and everything. Getting stuff that's a little more out there, at least once in a while, to just wet your beak in something different. I think there's value in that. I mean, I don't like to read the same stuff every day, right? And I think even when I'm making stuff, I try not to harp on the exact same topics all the time. Like you said, there are certain ones that do better. Usually when I'm bagging on Rolex, or people really like it when I talk smack. I've tried to not tone that down, but just dial it back a little in my maturity, I guess you'd say, and focus on more relatable things. But people love smack talk. Like the whole moon swatch thing was just like a solid like 72 hours of just hysteria of people like, make more moon swatch memes, like just dogging this thing. And I'm like, I don't really want to do that. It's more just like the hype over this sort of toyish $260 quartz watch. But like you said, again, I don't have any real aversions towards quartz. I mean, I have this little new Pad-Eye quartz Seiko Solar right here. A lot of fun. And I think, you know, that's my kind of beater watch. Like you were talking about how people would kind of gravitate towards a Casio or something. That's what I love quartz watches for, is something that I'm not going to be too concerned what I do with it. But at the same time, like, still a cool watch. It's still got the Pad-Eye markings on it. So like, that's awesome. You know, what's not to like? But that's definitely very cool. Also talking in watches that have a purpose, I did see an article you wrote for Gear Patrol about a submarine watch.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I'm a sucker for sort of like true military heritage stories. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, that was I don't remember when I wrote it, but it was pretty early on. I mean, that was definitely, it was probably pre my blog. It was pre the Wristorian, and it was, you know, not long after that piece came out on Hodinkee about the Seiko. So that was, so when I started writing freelance for Gear Patrol, I sent in some samples. They were like, you know, and this is how I've experienced it with other companies too. It was like, yeah, okay, we'll give you, your writing's fine, we'll give you a shot kind of thing. Write up like, and so I think I wrote up like a generic article that was like 5 vintage Seikos you can get for under $500 or something like that, you know? So I picked models I liked, wrote it, they like approved it. And then I pitched the other idea. I had bought that watch. So that's an old Caravel, like late 60s, probably like 67 ish. Caravel, I think, is sort of like the sort of like younger sibling of Bulova. It's like a little bit more value friendly, right? And that was a good example. So that was one that like I had mentioned earlier with other watches, that I had found on eBay. And I want to say, I don't think it was listed in like the watches page. It was listed in like the history and military page or something, like military collectibles. And I noticed that submarine on the dial and the silent service insignia, both are on the dial. And I can't remember what the description said, but whatever it was led me to believe that the person selling it, that was their watch, like they were the original owner of that watch. And I want to say it was like almost kind of sad. I mean, this person obviously was older at that point. And I want to say I got that watch and like some other like, pins and stuff, like military service pins and things that came with it. And I want to say I got it for like $60, $65, like $45. It doesn't run. I mean, I haven't had it. Pretty small. It's like 30, it's got to be like 33, 34 millimeters. It's on the small side. But I reached out to, I obviously I bought it and I reached out to the seller. His name was Walter, and he was very nice. And I just sort of asked him the history about it. And he basically told me nobody in his family wanted it, but that he had bought it. And he told me the story. And basically he was in the Navy. He was stationed, I think, in Scotland. Yeah, in Scotland. And he on a couple different like Polaris submarines, right? And that's what's on the dial is a Polaris sub. So sort of like Cold War submarines. But he had served on the USS George C. Marshall. And they were like tracking a Russian sub or something. And this would have been like, I think 66, 67, if I remember right. And somehow they ended up colliding and it caused damage. Wow. George C. Marshall. I'm assuming it caused damage to both, but it certainly caused damage to the sub he was on. And they ended up having to obviously get back to like port. And then he went home after that to Connecticut, or at least he went to the Navy base there in Connecticut. And at that Navy base, I think his wife and I assume his mother and father-in-law were like meeting him, and he went to the shop on the base and he bought 4 watches from the shop. And I guess that's the watch he bought 2 of that model. And then he bought 2 like smaller women's watches. But he said on the base, you could just for a short amount of time, they sold that watch with the silent service, sort of insignia on the Caravel. And then of course the Polaris submarine for people who had served on a Polaris submarine. And so he bought it and he said he wore his for years later in the Navy, and he gave one to his father-in-law. He ended up losing his. And so the one he sold was actually his father-in-law's. And it was sort of like, without getting too sort of like gooey about like watch collecting and like the romance of it, he said father-in-law really liked the watch, wore it in a bunch of pubs throughout like Scotland, and just like really kind of treasured the watch. So, it's funny because that one's, I guess it's a military watch, but I think sometimes we sort of go like, oh, this one was in Vietnam and it was worn by like a Navy SEAL who jumped out of in a ghillie suit, like out of a bush, and like took out 20 enemies. And this one was very much not like that. In fact, this one wasn't, other than being bought on a military base, wasn't like a military service watch, right? It was just worn by a guy who appreciated the gift. And as much as I appreciate the military watches, I don't write as much about them. I just don't come across as many stories. And, obviously a lot of people, depending on when they served in the military, if you're talking Vietnam era and stuff, like my grandfather was like that. He served in Vietnam. A lot of them don't care to really talk even about that time. And so it's one thing to dig into people's history as like a scuba diver, but digging into history that's like actual war and things like that, people don't really, I'm not.
It's a little touchy.
Yeah, and I'm not even super comfortable with the idea of like romanticizing it too much. So that's why I'm so sort of drawn to. I do like military watches, but that's why I'm so drawn to like military adjacent or something, like with pigeon racing, something totally right. People are gonna listen to this and be like, why is that guy obsessed with pigeon racing? I don't know anything about pigeon racing. I literally just know watches were made for it and they have a pigeon on the dial, and it was a thing. But
this might be the next big vintage trend. I'm not gonna lie to you.
I really hope it's not. I mean, I keep an eye out, but they don't pop up on eBay too often. I want to just like lock one in. A lot of the watches in my collection I'm like trying to get, and it's funny because I think I'll do that. I'll rationalize it in my mind, like, or you know, that's another thing about having a twin is I'm like, is this crazy or is this pretty cool? I mean, is it just me or is a pigeon on your dial cool? And he's like, it's obvious. It's cool. Yeah, it's obvious. Trust me, you're gonna want to get this.
Any bird on the dial,
right? Yeah. So that's another thing where I'll hoard these watches, and I'm like, I don't want people to catch on. And you know, in 10 years, people will still not care. The value of them will have gone down, and it will just be me with a bunch of pigeon racing watches. And like, trust me, someday they're gonna take off. You know, but that's a funny part of collecting for me.
Yeah, that specific article. In just I remember looking at the post, and it just reminded me of maybe one of the most badass scenes in any movie involving a watch, which is Hunt for Red October, when Connery's standing there as Ramius, and he's timing in his head how long he has before the torpedo is going to catch him, and they have to do countermeasures and swerve and everything. And he's sitting there, and they're like, "We have to do it," and he's like, "Shh," and he's just got his little pocket watch, and he's like, now, and the whole thing works out, and you're just like, wow, that was pretty slick. And you know, obviously he has his moment with the Bond sub and everything, but to have two, that's pretty wild. It's cool that you did mention that he bought it on a base. I actually have a friend who just got his grandfather's Longines pocket watch fixed. His grandfather bought it, I think, at the end of World War II, or at the end of his deployment. He was coming home. He bought it, and I think it broke in transit, and he never got it fixed. And he somehow got his hands on it, and he's like, maybe I can contact Longines and see about this. And he did, and they're like, send it back. We'll clean it up. Now he's got this, and it works. Like, he has this pocket watch. It's just cool. Like, it came from the war era. Again, it didn't necessarily go through it. And I don't think he said his grandfather was like super involved, but you know, he was stationed over there, and he wound up back over here. This watch came all the way from, I want to say, that somewhere in Germany or Austria or somewhere over there, made its way to here, and now it's sitting in, you know, his drawer in New York. It's just kind of wild, like how it all works that way.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, definitely. And that's the thing, is like, you know, that some history is a bit more mundane than others, and obviously, yeah, if we can talk about aquanauts who spent weeks undersea back when that was really, really cutting edge. I mean, even now that's pretty crazy, but
yeah,
you know, like obviously those are like the really big stories, but that was one thing I enjoyed about that particular watch, was it wasn't really flashy, you know. And what's funny is, even talking to people who wore these watches in some pretty serious situations, you know, like the serious situations they tell us about probably don't even scratch the surface of like the things they actually did, either because they can't tell us because it's like G14 classified, or just they were just like, that was just my life. Like I was, you know, I was like deep diving for 30, 40 years, and the stuff that's like incredible to us, they were just like, oh, it was just a Wednesday.
Everyday stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So even then you can't really get all the stories. And so, you know, but that's part of what you try to do, is just tell the stories we can. And it's nice when people reshare them, and it's nice when people appreciate them. And my site is not probably ever going to be a Hodinkee sized blog, and that's totally fine with me, because I have another job that, you know, and family that takes up some of my time. But you know, I love getting, you know, emails from people that are like, man, that's crazy. I never knew that watch was involved in Sea Lab, or I never knew this or that. And it's nice. It's like, okay, I contributed something to the hobby, you know, something of some value to someone, you know.
Yeah, and that actually, what you were just talking about is actually a conversation I've been having with Devin recently. Mm-hmm. Just talking about sort of the everyday divers that people wore, because I think today everybody gets a little bit spec obsessed, and you know, you see this is the ultra deep, this is the deep sea, and they have these kind of honking watches, and they have all these crazy specs about them, but sort of back in the day, those weren't really a thing. And while over-engineered is hot now, it doesn't necessarily jive with that historic diver that you're talking about. In that respect, like what what are sort of the common threads among divers historically that you've noticed? Because just even from talking now, right, we're talking about like Scuba Pro 450s, or we're talking about, Willards. Like, these are some of the common ones. Like, what is sort of the going rate for your historic divers that you find, I guess, of people who either did commercial, or whether it be, I don't want to say adventure, I guess research would be the word. What's sort of like the benchmarks for historical divers in that respect?
What do you think?
Well, one thing I try to think about with some of these divers is that at the early onset of dive watches, you think Rolex, Zodiac, Blanc Pond being a big one as well. Yeah. And think about those. So we'll say in the 50s, and I have a Blanc Pond, a smaller Blanc Pond, 50 fathoms from the late 50s. And it's obviously rated to 50 fathoms, which is, I think, a little bit less than 100 feet or something.
That sounds much more badass than it is. I was a little taken back to find out that was not that
deep.
But
yeah, it's not that deep.
But for the time period, probably it was.
That's the thing, yeah. So in the 50s, scuba was a relatively, skin diving had become popular. It was, sort of snorkeling, basically, glorified. Yes, and then scuba diving was relatively new. So the depths they were able to go to weren't that great. So you look at the 50s, you might, from modern day view, from my view now, I look at 50 fathoms and go, oh, that's 100 feet or something. Like, that's a pretty weak depth rating, but it was really good for them then.
Yes.
And then in the 60s, you see a jump in depth ratings because people were able to go deeper in the 60s because scuba had advanced. And then that just obviously kept climbing into the 70s with 600 meter watches like the Blow Prof, or 750 meter watches. And in the 80s and past that, things obviously got more and more crazy. So I think for me, one of the threads to look at is just that, like, nowadays, no one really needs a dive watch for actual diving. So in a way, I feel like we're kind of back at the area we probably were maybe in the late 50s and 60s, where we'd probably all be fine with something that was 50 fathoms or was 100 meters, just because at this point, the greatest depths we can go to, we can just send a remote operated vehicle there from a safe location, and it can withstand those depths. We don't really need a watch that can go to that. But I think Justin can probably speak to, like, there's a lot of common watches we've seen people either have as a primary, or maybe even in addition to other, maybe more overbuilt watches. And I'm sure he can speak to some of that as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes my train of thought isn't really answering the question that you have. And I sort of have two trains of thought. One is that the overbuilt watches of like the 60s and 70s, there's features you find on some of those that I love, that I wish a lot more companies would focus on specific features rather than saying, I got to create 1,000 meter diver. Like, cool things were happening with watches. Like, you hear the helium escape valve reference a lot, and that was a technological feat. And I don't want to detract from that. But like, like I said, Devin's wearing a Shark Hunter right now. I have a watch that has that same bracelet as the Shark Hunter, the old Expandro Doxa bracelet.
Yep. And
it still blows my mind that Doxa was making. In fact, that's one of my biggest gripes with modern Doxa, is that they don't have adjustable bracelets. I love what Doxa is doing now, and it's just like one of my favorite things about that old watch. And those watches you're talking, they had that in the 60s, right? 67 or something was a sub 300. So it's, and other companies did too. But, we're not talking like like Rolex, like hair puller, like expanding bracelets. We're talking clasp. And that's awesome on basically if you give me any dive watch with that, that's awesome. It doesn't have to be a deep diver. It's just like, that's a technology that I think we see it sometimes now, but that's like a great thing they could learn from that generation. Like the kind of sort of like captive bezel, or whatever they call it, bezels that require like a Blow Prof, so that requires like a trigger thing, button to turn it, or old Certina PH500s, DS2 PH500s, which are kind of, among really nerdy people, they were used in Tektite, an undersea program. Those are big, beefy dive watches, but those had like that same kind of pressure. You couldn't turn the bezel without applying pressure to it. So captive bezel. There's like cool features like that I think I don't need to see 1,000 meter diver, but I would love to have 150, 200 meter diver modern that has that adjustable bracelet or that bezel that. There's really cool things like that. And then the other thing is, I think it's like a watch collector or like watch enthusiast sort of problem, where in general people want like the bigger, like badder thing. It's like the people my truck's not big enough. I got to lift it. We're in the Midwest, so we definitely see our fair share of like big, it's like my truck is, it's huge, but I got to make it huger, And so it's like, it's that kind of mentality. And I'm sort of guilty of that with watches too. Like not all of my watches are big, but I do like a big watch, but I think it's just us rationalizing it. It's, we rationalize, I need a screw down crown. Like I got to have it. Devin, is out there like doing field research as a biologist. He has, I guarantee, more need for it than I do. I work in like a pharmaceutical clinic. So like, I'm not in the water at all. I'm not in any danger really at all. I'm in a very like sort of medical office environment. But, it's like, I think watch collectors, we have a tendency to say like, we overestimate ourselves in general. I need that. But then, it's good to remember that like these skin divers, like Devin said, that US divers 50 fathoms, that relabeled Blanc pond that he has. Like, I remember when we found it on eBay, he found it and pointed it out. I mean, it's small. It's like 34 millimeters. Honestly, it kind of just looks like almost like a generic, like it's almost like a dress watch with a bezel. Like it's like they took a very generic, almost dress watch. It's got like a hobnail dial. It's like stuff you just don't see on divers. Yeah, and it's got gilt lettering. I mean, the lettering is fantastic. That's like the coolest part. And it does have a little bezel, a little like friction bezel. But like that watch literally just looks like they took something from some company that was like a dress watch. It was like, we'll add the text and we'll add a bezel to it. And, and the Seikos, so the watches that you commonly see, like you said, 6105s are everywhere. And I have a 6105, it doesn't have a screw down crown. It's got that weird like push lock thing. Those watches worked for people, so like we rationalize that we need screw down crowns or that we need this or that. But then it's like, that's where history really comes in and you go, okay, well, people were climbing Everest with like an old Smith's wristwatch, right? And that handled Everest.
Yep.
None of us are, none of the three of us at least are climbing
No, sir.
daily, right? So like, and I'm guilty of it too, but like I have a Nomos I got a few years ago. Like it's a Nomos club. I could probably wear that Nomos club doing everything I'll do for the rest of my life, and it would be totally fine. So it's just me. It's a me thing. I like dive watches. I like this, but at some point, I think you kind of have to have like some self-awareness, and there's totally nothing wrong with it because like I'm not going to wear that Nomos club every day for the rest of my life. But I think it's at some point you do have to be like honest with yourself and say like, I can buy it. I can get myself a Pelagos or something. Yeah. I definitely don't need it. I'm not adventurous enough. I'm, who am I kidding? But, that's really the plight of like, that's the thing about these people who wore them back in the day is we focus so much on specs and capabilities and stuff that I think we psych ourselves out. Like, it's only good to 100 meters.
Yeah, agreed on that.
I know it's not 100 meters, but like, what if the force of my stroke is actually like 120 meters in a flood? Or like I've heard people say, like, what if like the water of the shower head hits directly onto the crown? They're like, it's like I can only take a glancing blow. I can't take, I can't take a direct hit to the crown. Yeah, and I think it's like a weird byproduct of being like too focused on like specs that don't really matter and overestimating our own adventure. Like I know I'm not a strong enough swimmer probably to create enough force to like flood the crown of my Nomos, let alone an actual dive watch. So it's just funny. So yeah, the big ones that show up in history a lot of them are Seiko. I mean, really, I wrote an article for my blog that was, I think it was like 10 different photos from the archives of just 6105s because we had just seen so many. I was like, that kind of illustrates just how prevalent that watch was, for every like Rolex that was bought at a PX or whatever, people bought, 15, 20 of those Willards or Turtles or whatever. And you just see them like everywhere. And like I said, for better or worse, they didn't have a screw down crown. They didn't, I don't even know if the original like Doxas had a screw. I know some Doxas, some 300, some didn't later, but T's didn't have a screw down crown for a while. Yeah. So it's just, we get hyper focused and really like 100 meters, you're good to go. And I think we're starting to see that sort of return of the skin diver a little bit. I think we're starting to see people, there's always going to be the big watch people. And I like having one or two in my collection, but at the end of the day, like a thinner watch is just more comfortable. You know, it's more comfortable.
I agree.
That's one thing I really like about vintage quartz. You know, well, any quartz like that Seiko of yours. I've looked at that model before, and I think that's a pretty thin model, isn't it?
It is. It is. I think it's under 12. I think it's like either 10 something or 11 something.
Yeah, that's probably that's probably. You know, I just don't have a lot of modern watches. That's probably one of my top. If I was going to get a modern Seiko, I think that's like one of the models that's really more appealing to me. Is that it's thin. It's sort of it sort of harkens back to some of the old you know, quartz Seiko divers like early on that were also super rugged, and you see them used in like a lot of different historical photos. Yeah, like I said, during the summer you're wearing t-shirts, you wear those big bulky watches, but if I was going to wear like one watch, yeah, I'd happily sacrifice water resistance for like a little bit more just comfort and like wearability, and, you know, and call it good. So I think, like I said, the plight of the watch collector, we're too focused on specs, and it's like, we got to get those extra millimeters in, you know, and water resistance. So, yeah.
And in touching on that, I know you've mentioned a few so far, but if you had to pick, I guess, what would you say are sort of like the pillars of either of your collections as far as your super cool historical pieces you have?
What do you think, Dustin?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like a broken record with this Seiko, that turtle of mine, but that one's probably the sort of like cornerstone. And in terms of, I mean, I have two watches that historically I think are really worthwhile. My favorite probably is that Seiko Turtle, that MSST version that I have. So much so actually that for Christmas last year, my wife secretly got like a big like drawing of it made, like a hand drawing of it. And it's by a guy. I'll have to plug him, but on Instagram it's McDonald RM. It's definitely he does some really, really cool like watch artwork, and I think he's done some work for like commissioned by Grand Seiko. Yeah. He's done some really cool stuff, and he did a cool Doxa. He'll do like just the handset from a specific. He did one with the Willard and a Doxa. So he did this it's like this awesome, like huge, and it captures like every scratch on the bezel. I mean, it's like an exact recreation of my watch. It's phenomenal. But that one's really sort of a cornerstone in my collection, just because I'm just a huge sucker for sort of like special dials, additional dial text. Even if you get into like even the Tiffany signed stuff, I mean, I don't have any of that. But even if it's something as simple as like just a retailer signed watch, I just like having like, you know, bonus points if it's like super obscure and funny, like
that
pigeon. Because like I have another one it's not pigeon racing, but you know, it's an old Hamilton. You know, like kind of like what you picture those like you know, old Hamilton, like khaki, like military looking, you know, like 80s Hamilton military watch kind of stuff.
Like you get like the LL Bean editions and stuff like that.
It's exactly the same as that. And there's some good sites that have like, LL Bean is is probably the best example of it. But then there's like other little outdoor companies and those types of things that have also like printed their branding on the dial. And I just happened to buy one on eBay, I think earlier this year, for a company called Victor Woodstream. And Victor now, the company still exists, but Victor now just basically makes mouse traps. Like it's got a big, so like on the dial, it's got like a big, I couldn't tell what it was when I first saw it. It was like, I knew it was a Hamilton. I recognized the model, but I had never seen that dial, like that branding. And I didn't even totally recognize it. So it says Victor, and then it has like a Woodstream logo. It doesn't really say Hamilton on the dial anywhere except at the very bottom under 6 o'clock, where it normally would say like Swiss or T Swiss or whatever. It says Hamilton in little letters, but you need like a loop to see it. But it has like a big picture, and I thought it was like an aviation related thing because I thought it was like the front of a plane or like a helicopter. I couldn't tell. And so I did some quick Googling, and I ended up finding it's actually a picture of like one of those old timey like bear traps with like arms sticking out, and, like, you know, the big teeth that like grab. So I'm not pro you know, catching animals like that or anything, but the watch itself was like very. So Devin and I, it's like when we talk about that watch, I just refer to it as the rat trap, just because it's like, because all the company does now is literally just make like mouse killing devices, and it's the only one I've ever seen. I've never seen. I can't find another example on the internet. I can't find a catalog. But basically that company back then was sort of like LL Bean. Like they produced, like gun cases and traps and fishing supplies. So they were like an outdoor retailer. So I like the little, I wouldn't call that one a cornerstone, but that I'm just a sucker for like any, that's why the MSST is so special to me, is because it does have just that little bit of text that's, that other people's don't have. I guess I'm sort of like an elitist in that sense. Like, I'll turn my nose up at other people's standard turtles because mine has, yours wasn't from Antarctica. It doesn't have this on the dial, right? And
Take that, Domino's Pizza Rolex.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because I love those too. And everybody in my family, there was at one point I wanted to get one, but like basically my wife especially, but like in Devin were sort of like, are you sure you want one of those? And now they're like $12,000.
I know.
Now, even if I wanted to. And so it's funny. So I missed the boat on those when they were like, a couple thousand or something. But that's probably the biggest one in my collection. What about you?
For me, I started out with getting really into scuba branded dive watches. So it'd be like a good example would be the watch I'm wearing, which is my sub 300T Shark Hunter from 1970. I got it from the original owner, and it's one that I wanted for a long time. Partially because they're awesome, and then partially because they're also signed with U.S. Divers Aqualung on the dial.
Yeah.
So it's kind of one of the big, great examples of co-branding between a watch manufacturer and a distributor that just specialized in scuba. So that was one that I had looked for a long time, and to get it from the original owner and everything was really a great thing. As far as other vintage things, we mentioned the U.S. Divers branded Blanc Pond 50 Fathoms. It's the small version, so not quite as well known as some of the larger versions from back in the day, but it has the 50 fathom script on the dial, and it says U.S. Divers where it would normally say Blanc Pond, just because U.S. Divers got a hold of Blanc Pond and was like, we want to sell these through our catalogs. And it's also my oldest dive watch at right around like 1958. It's getting back a ways. So that was one I didn't imagine I'd ever get, and I just kind of got lucky looking through lots on eBay and spotting that you could zoom in on one of the photos in this lot of maybe 20 or 25 watches, and you could just make out where it said U.S. Divers 50 Fathoms in like the classic cursive script. And Justin and I were able to get it from this person and for a pretty good price. And it certainly shows some wear, but it's one I never anticipated being able to get. And I was familiar with them before I found it. So it helps to gain a lot of knowledge and look at a lot of things so that if you do see something pop up, you recognize, oh, this is something special,
we always hear about like the magic flea market find, right? The legendary bucket of watches with the 50 fathoms in it. For some reason, that's always the one people go with.
And I found one of the old JB Champion like Moonwatch Speedmaster bracelets, the ones they wore on one mission. I found one of those, and I bought a jar of just watch bracelets for like $15 at a local flea market that him and I would go to quite a bit. And I didn't see it in there. I just bought it going, maybe there's a cool bracelet in here I can use on something. And I remember I didn't know about those being used on Speedmasters at the time. So I thought, oh, this is a cool bracelet. It was complete. And I put it on some of my watches and wore it around. And I let him borrow it. And I think he Googled it. And he texted me. He was like, you might want to like take back this one bracelet you lent me, because it turns out people try to get them for quite a bit. And so I ended up finding that. So that's my closest I get to like finding something somewhat valuable, I guess, at a flea market. But for vintage stuff, those are definitely pillars. And then modern stuff, I like Zinn quite a bit. And so since he mentioned I do a lot of field work as a biologist, and so I convinced myself I needed a pretty rugged watch at some point, and I've embraced that quite a bit, even though we just said you probably only need 100 meters and you may not need a screw down crown. And I have a Zinn T2B, which is 2,000 meters rated, and it's 40 millimeters and 13 millimeters thick. So for me, it was one of those watches that they really put the effort into.
Hey, they have a magic formula for dimensions for performance. I don't know what ratio you'd call it, but like, all their divers are like 500 meter, whatever. It's like, 11.8 thick. And I'm like, what?
The U50, they really embraced that. He had a U1, which I saw originally. I really liked the U1. It was big, but I mean, it's what I expected from it. And it was a tank, so it was a great watch, just indestructible feeling. But Zinn kind of, with the T2B, they kind of showed what they kind of flex their muscles in the dive watch space. Unfortunately, it wasn't that popular, so it got discontinued. But then with the U50, they kind of said, we'll flex our muscles again and bring out something that's 500 meters and 11.8 or whatever millimeters.
41 millimeters, like
what? Yeah, exactly. And so for my watch in the field, a lot of times I'm wearing that or a Tudor Black Bay ETA would be the other one I wear quite a bit. So for modern stuff, those I guess probably the pillars of my collection. But I have too many watches, so there's a bunch more than that. But those are my kind of my favorite, I guess, in general. So yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. Looks like we're right at about the hour mark. Is there anything else you guys want to hit on before we wrap this up?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if like I said, I'll save some stuff. So if we ever want to chat again, I'll have something to say. But
yeah, and thanks for having us on. I mean, like the watch community has been great as we've gotten into it, and we've had a lot of people sort of help along the way, or just be like even just messaging you on Instagram and you not just ignoring me the whole time. I've been lucky with that with quite a few people in the watch space and the watch community, so I'm always appreciative of that. But it's nice to get on here and share stuff, where we can. We're happy to do it.
Yeah.
No, thank you for hopping on with me. And I know we had kind of talked about it a little bit previously, but I know it's definitely an experience for people who don't do it often. I remember when I first did it, I was like, okay, like the blood was really going. I remember the first time I was like, I can't believe this is gonna happen. Like, what if I just flop on my face? But I had a little more of an act to pitch than than most do, but thanks for hopping on with me and nerding out a little bit. It's been a lot of fun, and hopefully we can save some for next time. We can do this again, maybe with the Schmitster, because he's an actual diver. He does recreational, but he does do some pretty cool stuff.
Well, he's still ahead of us then.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we just talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
So thanks for hopping on. It's been a pleasure, and for everybody at home, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time here on the Wrist Cheese Radio Podcast. Gentlemen.
Thanks. See ya.